I'm Miss Andrea.
And I'm Miss Mary.
And this is CheesePress. Before we get into today's
activity,
let's do a little business.
Sure. And also explain why we're doing what we're about to do. Go for it.
So we write history curriculum. And a big function of our history program is getting kids to investigate history. And so, out here in the history worlds, in the history textbooks, in the history videos, there are a lot of myths and misconceptions being perpetrated. And so we have filled our little basket with a bunch of myths, and we're going to discuss them today.
Talk about them. We're going to
find out more about our history.
Talk about what a lot of people in the culture believe and what's actually accurate.
So to find out more about our history curriculum, check out
CheesePressPublishing.com.
Thank you. That CheesePressPublishing.com. We are just getting back into semester 2 of the school year. There's a lot of nervous energy because stuff is about to go down. The first thing or the second thing that's about to go down is we're doing auditions on Friday for Julius Caesar. If you have kids who love to act, middle and high school, who are in the Northeast Atlanta area, Gwinnett specifically,
or willing to travel to Gwinnett
regularly,
twice a week
for 6 weeks, give us
and every day during Tech Week.
Yes. Check out our website, www.hazelwoodprep.org, and send us a message, and we will get them in to the auditions.
And for those of you who don't have students that fit that fairly narrow category of location and age and fun things like that, we also need sponsors to make this fabulous theater program a thing. We actually rent space out from our local professional theater for our performances, and it's not a classroom play. We bring in professional theater tech people to guide our students, because the students actually get hands-on experience through our theater program, but they get to work alongside people who are working in the industry, whether that's light, sound, whatever. All of that takes money, and so we have sponsorship information also on hazelwoodprep.org, so head over there if you're interested in sponsoring what we're doing here. Oh, it's definitely glitching.
Okay, so we're back, and apparently we're having technical issues. So, we were discussing the Dark Ages, the myth that the Dark Ages is often portrayed as a time of complete ignorance and stagnation in Europe after the fall in Rome.
Right.
Quick synopsis.
So what we had talked about is the fact that Rome didn't fall, that the Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Roman Empire, and it kept doing all the things that Rome was doing for a long time after that. What does it, so your slip there says fact, and what does that say?
It says, while there were certainly hardships, many significant advancements took place during this period, including the preservation of classical knowledge by monks and the development of early universities. The term Dark Ages has been criticized by historians. I knew this was going to be fun for you.
I don't know that I agree with their facts so much. Yes, there was some preservation of knowledge by monks. Yes, you do have the earliest universities starting to be founded. What knowledge monks chose to preserve was selective. There was a practice of copying information, but then also
the religious people always select what was going to be preserved.
They did, to the point that one of the main ways of recording information was on animal hide. And
yes, vellum.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you would have documents and information and stuff that was written on them, and we have some of these vellum artifacts that are from the Middle Ages, medieval era in Europe. And what the monks would do is they could actually take like a scraper and scrape the information off of it. So you basically destroyed the text, and they wrote religious texts on top of it. We still have that information today because you can use technology to
x-ray it,
pull out what was written there before the scraping. And so we actually know what some of those texts are. But I don't know that there was necessarily this concerted effort by monks to preserve,
understand this is still very textbooky.
Yeah. Most of our preservation of the ancient world that's happening in that time is happening in the Byzantine Empire, not in Europe. And largely, which they completely left out. So largely in Europe, yes, information's still happening. Yes, there is still learning. There are still innovations. That's largely being controlled by the early church. And some things, if anything that is deemed maybe contrary to what the church wants, is intentionally repressed in a lot of places. And so, no, in Europe, there is a distinct lack of knowledge for the vast majority of Europeans. There is an elite class, there's a clerical class, there is a churched class that are maintaining some of these records, but most of the maintenance is happening in the Byzantine Empire. All right, so I'm going to pull one and ask you. Let's see what we have. It is upside down. Africans didn't have a system of governance before European colonization. So the myth is the idea that Africa had no political or governance systems before colonialism is a widespread misconception.
It's the same misconception that Native Americans had no rules of governance before colonialism. It's just a colonialism-ism that people didn't have any lives or culture before the Europeans came over and taught us how to be, which is crap.
I have my own thoughts on this one.
Think on, because I'm trying not to use swear words.
So this particular myth is actually even more insidious because when Europe decided that they wanted to colonize the places that they could colonize, there was a very intentional spreading of propaganda that was used to justify land grabs along their sea routes.
Oh, sorry. I just had a flash of current events.
It was very intentional propaganda, and it is something that has persisted.
Because apparently we're taking over Panama? Oh, anyway, go ahead.
So on here it says, the fact is that many African societies had complex systems of governance, including the Ashanti Kingdom, the Kingdom of Mali, the Zulu Kingdom, all of which had well-organized political structures, laws, and leadership systems long before European colonization.
If the Europeans hadn't known how rich some of Africa was, they wouldn't have even gone over there. So anyway.
Also, though, it's
simplistic.
so wild how the Western educational system wants to pretend Egypt wasn't part of Africa. And they weren't.
If you can walk there,
but also that it was also like as though this were some kind of standalone paragon of the ancient world and didn't exist anywhere else. They weren't trading and intermarrying with the peoples that lived south of them.
Reminds me of the name of the nation right below Egypt because it is escaping me.
So because the name changes. Largely, so there's some reference to the Nubian culture.
Yes.
There's sometimes that area and that depending on the time period, because you have different people coming in and ruling that part of the land, it changes names.
So if this is Africa, the continent, and this part here is Egypt, right? This part here was the African kingdom sitting.
That's not how
geography
works.
Wrong side.
But also that's not how geography works.
But there was a spot right below it, and they were trading cultures back and forth. They were ruling each other because they would conquer them and they would rule them.
And they would intermarry, and there were political marriages between those cultures.
A lot of the things that we have labeled as Egyptian,
they stole,
was actually African. Although Egypt is still Africa, so.
Right. But from cultures that were immediately south of them, there also were plenty of cultures that were generally west of that area.
Right, but my thing is Egypt was more north, and then the main kingdom was
but when you're doing this, that's the entire Mediterranean coast.
No, Mediterranean is up here. Egypt's at the top, and then sitting right under Egypt was a powerful African nation that they call Nubia.
Nubia's the culture was Nubia at some point. There were at least 3 different major cultures that.
My geography sucks, but I know what they were doing.
More interestingly, because again, we're talking about before European colonization, so we're not just talking about the ancient world, we're also talking about the medieval era.
Yes.
So you start talking about.
I'm saving the richest man in the world here because I know he's in his basket somewhere.
We'll get to that at some
But
point.
he was from Africa.
No, but you want to talk about early church history when the Christian Gospels are being written. There are actually preserved some of the oldest copies of the earliest Gospels that we have prior to canonization that are preserved in Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm.
And they're native to that because the people living in what's now Ethiopia were huge trading partners of everybody that's happening in the Middle East, and they were right there in the formation of everything. They didn't come sit in on the Council of Nicaea. So now history's like, well, that didn't happen.
I was raised in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church.
But you also didn't believe that it was as old a religion as it is.
Until I found out that they had the oldest Bible. I thought the Ethiopians were like, I like that Catholic thing.
Nope. They were around when all of the canonization, when all of the church formation was happening, and they just didn't join in with the Roman train of thought on it.
Woo. Oh. It's so frustrating in a way. Cleopatra was Egyptian.
Oh.
It is widely believed that Cleopatra was Egyptian.
So that comes from the fact that Cleopatra was an Egyptian pharaoh. So she ruled over Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
However, what a lot of people don't know is that toward the end of Egypt's ancient period, ancient Greece had taken over everything. And so once you get to the Ptolemy and all of those, there were a handful of pharaohs.
Ptolemy spelled with a P.
Yes. Ptolemy is, so the first letter of Ptolemy is P. Mm-hmm. But all of the pharaohs ruling under the Ptolemy, I guess it was still a dynasty.
Which is, here's the
they were all Greek.
Here's the interesting
and Cleopatra
thing.
was Greek.
Because a lot of people like to bust that myth like to bust the Cleopatra myth by saying, why is Elizabeth, what's her name, portraying Cleopatra?
Oh.
Why is Cleopatra white?
Yeah, Elizabeth Taylor, yep.
Because she was. Cleopatra was actually a white lady. What the Greeks did when they took over a country, actually the Romans did it too. Mm-hmm. They were very smart.
The Romans did everything the Greeks did. Let's be.
They were very smart. They were like, we're going to rule you now, but we're not going to change your systems, and we're not going to change your governance. We're just going to take one of our people and sit them in that seat.
Yep. They'll just oversee all of the things that you are already doing.
So she was actually white because she was Greek. What was the original question again? No, and she was not Egyptian.
Well, what does it say about the facts?
Oh.
Is there anything weird in that?
Cleopatra the Seventh, last pharaoh of Egypt, was of Greek descent, coming from the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great. Her family was Macedonian Greek, and she was the first Ptolemaic ruler to speak the Egyptian language.
It doesn't tell us that there were a handful before her. They just didn't speak the Egyptian language. It doesn't tell us that.
So I'm why they got away with it, and that's why the people accepted them, because they didn't come in and say, now you're going to do things our way. They said, we're going to take one of our people, and they're going to come over there and do things as much your way as we agreed to.
That's nice.
So generous.
Yeah. So the first one of this dynasty is Ptolemy I Soter. He was a general of Alexander the Great, and they ruled Egypt from 305 to 30 BCE. So almost 300 years. Yeah. So honestly, they would have continued ruling Egypt, except that the Romans came in and took over. Octavian was the one that took care of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
My turn to read to you, right?
No, you just...
Okay, go for it.
Women in ancient Egypt were oppressed. Myth. It is often assumed that women in ancient Egypt were oppressed and had few rights.
Moses' mother was not oppressed.
So this is one that I kind of am questioning. Who believes that, like, often assumes that women in ancient Egypt were oppressed? Is that part of the cultural narrative?
Mm-hmm.
I've never heard that before.
Women have always been.
Well,
The average person feels like they always have been. I didn't know until I knew early on because I liked Greek mythology. So then eventually I learned about Athenians, and then I learned about the Greeks, and because that misconception that there were Greek gods and then there were Romans. I was getting there, and that's how I learned about other cultures and how women have been in other cultures. But that's because I took interest in that. But when I talked to other people, I learned that they believe that women has always taken the back seat to men in almost every culture.
I mean, ancient Egypt is not my area of knowledge. American history is. But I've just never heard before that ancient Egyptian women were oppressed. I have nothing.
Yeah, there are several very well documented female pharaohs.
Right.
Women in ancient Egypt had more rights than many of the other ancient civilizations. They could own property, divorce, and even rule. Notable examples include Hesepet. That's probably not pronounced correctly. I'm terrible at pronouncing things.
That's about right.
And Cleopatra. Cleopatra the Seventh was Greek.
She was not Egypt.
But no, there are others.
I'm just looking at the biblical stuff, and those women were not. I just don't think even when men were ruling, the women still stepped in and got their way.
That's a misconception that in a patriarchal society, women have no rights.
I don't know that Egypt was that patriarchal because there were male pharaohs and female pharaohs.
Right.
There are significantly fewer female pharaohs than there were male pharaohs.
Yeah.
I think that
was that just succession?
Some of that was succession. Some of that, I think, really, we've got such a large span of Egyptian history that things really change from dynasty to dynasty, and there were so many dynasties.
Also, we don't have Egyptian history good. Like, we don't have detailed Egyptian history.
We have
the bits and pieces that were preserved by.
Most of what we have from Egyptian history does come from funerary architecture. That's the murals and other artwork that are associated inside the tombs.
Pyramids, yeah.
Well, I mean, there are pyramids. There are other kinds of tombs. There's all sorts of. There were fads. Ancient Egypt. Every dynasty, things were different. The names of the gods are different. Everything just shifts and changes like any kind of culture, and you have
a dynasty. For anyone who doesn't know what a dynasty is a family of rulers that lasts anywhere from like 3 to like I don't know how many rulers, and then a new dynasty comes in.
And it might be a handful of decades. It might be a handful of centuries, just depending on how well they were doing their jobs, and
before someone came and said
how they passed on that lineage to the next generation. But no, throughout ancient Egyptian history, the names of gods change, the way that rites and buildings are built changes, and I mean, you have moments of the history where I'm sure that the patriarchy was a stronger influence than others, because just like, I mean, when you're talking about that kind of time period, things just change.
Women couldn't own land or property in history. Myth. It is often assumed that women never owned land or had property rights in history. That's dumb. Should I just throw it away?
No, because this is actually
well, yeah,
it's an interesting conversation, because that says more about how we teach history than it does about women's rights.
I think history gets generalized.
Well, first off, it's an extraordinarily
there's a lot of history. They kind of have to generalize
extraordinarily generalized
that
statement.
Yeah.
It's also such a Eurocentric statement. And in key parts of history that we study from Europe, it actually is true that women could not own land or property. There were absolutely moments in time, and it's wild because I went down this rabbit trail because with the last video that we recorded, there were a lot of things that were being said that might be technical facts, but they were being used to completely distort the history of what was being talked about.
Right.
And so I wound up down a number of rabbit holes because I was going to pull up things that refuted what was being said because it was being used in such a wild way. And part of that rabbit trail led me to, say, for instance, the Napoleonic Code. One of the most famous and most entrenched examples of legal governance in Western history, in which it specifically codified, emphatically, that women were the same social class, the same legal class as children and the mentally disabled, which in fact did mean that they could not own
women were
property
poor little tink-tinks.
or land. They could not participate in the political process because their status, legally codified for a very long time in France, was that women held the same legal class as children and the mentally disabled.
So this says just blah blah blah. While laws and customs often restricted women's property rights, many women were able to inherit or own property. In medieval and early modern Europe, noble women often controlled lands and estates, especially when their husbands were away or deceased. That's still very paternalistic, but something that just jumped in my mind was there are cultures where if the man died and they did the funeral pyre, they threw the woman on.
There are cultures that did that.
It's like, he's dead, you die too, jump in.
No. Or, we're going to open up this tomb and put them in, and there you go with them.
Yeet the wife in there too. Oh,
I mean, there are...
if your husband died, you would die.
Yeah, there were examples of that.
That was just laziness. That's
From
not
history.
taking care of widows.
There's some wild cultural things that have happened. Was that necessarily the norm in medieval Europe? I mean, I'm going to put out there that in the United States, it is only in very recent history that there was not the default assumption that the person handling the estate should be a man. Like, that is a fairly, mid 20th century change in legal status. And so, I mean, to me, the semantic of, well, some women could inherit property as long as their husbands died,
That's not good enough.
doesn't really speak to the heart of that myth.
At the end of the day, if you want to control a population, tell them they're better than someone else. Because they'll be so busy oppressing that person that they won't be looking at the ruler.
You said that out loud.
And out loud. And so it still is a governmental tactic to shiny,
Maintain power.
so that you can do what you want. And so women have been the brunt.
The myth, Napoleon was extremely short.
Napoleon was average height, probably 5'5", 5'6", which in France was the average height at that point in time. Napoleon chose tall generals. And he probably felt like, oh, big guys, they could fight good. And so when you lined Napoleon up amongst his generals, he was diminutive. The end.
That's interesting because this is crediting the misunderstanding is because he was about 5'7" or 1.69
I'm
meters.
shorter.
That it arose in differences between French and English measurements of the time, which then led to a misinterpretation of records.
That I don't know.
That's the first time I've heard that.
That I don't know,
So
but what I've
I would have
studied
to
most
fact check
recently is that he appeared short because he surrounded himself with tall people.
interesting.
That's the one I heard.
But also
I think I've said it to you before.
I could also see that there would be misconceptions, especially when we're talking about the English writing history about France, because they've
History
never had
is
a-
shady. History is shady.
shady. And they've
Chicago
never
is
had-
called the Windy City because they said that the rulers were full of hot air. Like, we just say
That's not the whole reason.
that was the main reason around the exhibition, the 1910 exhibition. That's when it started. They were like, those people are over there being braggadocious.
but it is.
That's where it
windy.
came from.
I mean, it's
It
also
was also
extraordinarily
windy as
windy.
heck, but that windiness didn't really start until tall buildings started going up. That's when
No, the windiness
The wind
is
tunnels.
The windiness is because there's not a hill between Chicago and anything to the west of it until you get to the Rockies.
But they started calling it the Windy City because of the politicians being braggadocious. So, like, we're just shady. Humans are shady.
Humans are shady.
And so we're going to throw shade.
Oh,
Oh,
there were long. I looked it up, and there is a political thing about the Windy City, but it was saying that they were long-winded.
yeah.
Yes.
I mean, they talked a lot,
They're
and
bragging.
they boast a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what came from.
That's interesting.
No,
That's
what
new
you
to
said
me.
was right. Is how you were saying it. Where I'm like, they're full of hot air.
Yeah.
Like, but meaning they're long-winded.
Yeah,
And they're, yeah.
They wouldn't shut up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you have myths that you'd like for us to discuss next time, then go ahead and leave that in the comments, and we will come back and talk about those myths.
Yes. So that's it for today.
Until next time.
Yes. Until next time.